Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Front Porch Friday. My name is Dr. Mary Osborne, and I'm the director of the Stewart House Museum in Monmouth, Illinois. Did you have a favorite book growing up? One of mine was from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. I liked both the idea of living in a museum and solving a mystery. There's something special about children's books in the way that they engage readers' attention. The availability of fiction for children is something we might take for granted today, but children's stories are a relatively modern concept. This episode of Front Porch Friday will take a look at some of the books belonging to Minnie Stewart's nieces and nephew that are a part of the museum's collection. The first stories targeted towards children appeared not in books, but in magazines in the early 19th century. The Youth's Friend was, quote, the first children's magazine to flourish in the United States, reaching a circulation of 10,000 subscribers by 1827, according to historian Paul Ringel. The magazine encouraged moral development and introduced such Christian doctrines as original sin and moral depravity. To the left is Michelangelo's Fall and Expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is meant to represent the concept of original sin. And to the right is an illustration, a reproduction of Rossetti's Hesterna Rosa, which represents the concept of moral depravity. Sounds riveting, doesn't it? The content of these stories aligned with the predominant societal beliefs about the nature of children. At the time, the Christian church held that children were inherently sinful and that they were basically miniature versions of adults. The concept of childhood as we know it did not emerge until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In fact, the term bedtime story was not even coined until the 1870s. You might say that Minnie's nieces, Lucretia and Isabel, grew up right along with the concept of children's literature. These are two images from our digital archives. The image to the left is of Isabel and her older sister Lucretia. Again, these are Minnie Stewart's nieces. They are the daughters of her older brother, William K. Stewart. Isabel, again, is the younger one. And then to the right, this photo, both of the photos are undated. The image to the right, they appear to be a few years older. I do have a couple of interesting observations about this photo. So there is Isabel, which she favors her mother's, the Mariners, her mother's side of the family, and then Lucretia, who tends to favor the Stewarts. And then between them, leaning on Lucretia, is their younger brother and William and Mary's youngest child and only son, Jimmy. And again, this photo is undated, but you may be wondering what's going on with their hair. We have a letter in our collection from Mary Mariner Stewart's father, Henry Mariner. And in this letter, he mentions that Lucretia and Isabel were suffering from scarlet fever. That letter is dated 1886, so that I think aligns kind of with the basic timeline as I know it. Jimmy was born in 1883. He looks to be about 3 years old there. And it was common at that time for parents or doctors to crop or shave children's hair if they had been suffering from a very high fever. So I would say that this image is probably from around 1886, and that they had just probably recovered from scarlet fever. So Isabel and Lucretia were born in the late mid 1870s. And over the next 40 years, the number of school children in the United States increased from 7 million to 20 million. In the late 19th century, children's leisure time became associated with the practice of reading. One of Lucretia and Isabel's books was written by Pansy, which is a nom de plume. And I have to the left there a copy of some of the stories that Pansy wrote, and then to the right is a book in our collection. The book many of the Stewart's books, the Stewart children's books, were presents from their grandparents, Minnie's parents, James and Isabel Stewart. Pansy was the nom de plume and childhood nickname of Isabella MacDonald Allen. In addition to writing children's stories, Alden edited the Presbyterian Primary Quarterly. She was heavily involved in both the temperance and Chautauqua movements. We go back to the images of the book covers. You can see there one of the stories is about the Chautauqua. Abstinence is also a common theme in many of the 100 books that Alden published from 1865 to 1929. Her stories contained moral precepts to help guide children and to help them avoid temptation. Pansy's work reflects the Christian proverb, train a child up in the way he or she should go. The preponderance of moralistic children's literature soon gave way to other types of stories, beginning in the cities where major publishers were located. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, perceptions about children began to change. A number of factors influenced this trend. Commercialization affected the content of children's literature as it did many other aspects of society. I couldn't find a relevant image of 19th century commercialization, especially as it appears in children's literature, but if I'm thinking about how it affected me as a child, if any of you are familiar with the American Girl series of books, not only are there a number of characters, which Kirsten was my favorite when I was growing up, and now they have added many more characters. But not only could you buy all of the books, but then you could buy the corresponding doll, and of course, there were a range of outfits and furniture and everything. So that is a great example of commercialization of children's literature that happened when I was a child. And then of course today we still Legos, Harry Potter, even though those books are, well, the first one has been published about 20 years ago. There's still a great deal of money to be made in licensing these characters. So a number of iterations. So really started to take off in the 19th century once we have the mass production of items really taking off. To increase revenue, magazines began to offer giveaways to children who sold the most subscriptions. Again, so we're not looking at the mass production of books right now, at least for children. Most children's stories are still featured in magazines, and that still occurs even today with some of the children's magazines. To the right, you can see that there is a competition for illustrating a story time, and even though the magazine isn't trying to sell subscriptions or get children to sell subscriptions, they are trying to increase their revenue. And although this isn't completely relevant to the point about giveaways, I do remember as a child really looking forward to the Scholastic book fairs and the number of books and other accessories and things that were available. But again, to increase revenue for Scholastic. So these are a more modern interpretation and kind of this concept. Publications also began to include articles by celebrity authors, such as Mark Twain. Overall, magazines were responding to middle-class parents' quest for social mobility. Even if they lacked the income to ascend the social hierarchy, they could trade on cultural capital, such as polite manners, Protestant morality, and owning the right type of goods. Children's magazines therefore prepared young readers for navigating this changing world and avoiding falling into corruption. For this reason, many authors, editors, and publishers eschewed sensational literature. Sensational stories capitalized on the rapid changes brought about by industrialization and urbanization. So they are full of action, a lot of emotion, as you can see, kind of embodied there, illustrated there in that cover. Particularly in children's stories, sensational stories would romanticize urban life and crime. Before 1890, many people viewed cities as running rampant with disease, immorality, and violence. Urban children suffered because of their exposure to these elements, according to moralistic literature. They might have been more sophisticated, but they were also shown to lack virtues such as honesty, perseverance, and courage. Children who belonged to the urban working class were also portrayed as sickly. Authors, on the other hand, praised country living for its physical and moral benefits. Some publishers, however, were beginning to embrace the City Beautiful movement and circulated stories featuring upstanding citizens who resided in urban areas. The City Beautiful movement is a trend that took off in the late 19th century. You think about the beginning of the Chicago World's Fair and the White City, and praised the progress that was taking place in these cities, and also called for aesthetic improvements to urban areas. So things like parks, other types of green spaces, art, and that is a great definition from Wikimedia there. So we see these changes also being reflected in the literature. And rather than condemning sensational literature outright, some authors and editors like Mary Mapes Dodge, the author of Hans Brinker or The Silver Skates, called for stories that stimulated children's imaginations. Not only did publishers begin to view childhood as a period of preparation rather than labor, but they also recognized that this period of development was lengthening. Stories gradually appeared that portrayed children as existing in a world separate from adults with no social obligations. When Lucretia and Isabel's younger brother was born in 1883, the golden age of children's literature had already begun. One of Jimmy's books, Little Lord Fauntleroy, illustrates the emerging trends in children's literature, as well as changing ideas about masculinity. Written by Frances Hodgson Burnett, Little Lord Fauntleroy first appeared as a serialized novel in the St. Nicholas magazine from November 1885 to October 1886. Scribner's then published the novel as a book in 1886. The protagonist, Cedric, is a passive figure whose morality reforms the adults around him through his innocent belief in people's goodness. Little Lord Fauntleroy enjoyed enormous success in the initial years after its release. In fact, it was one of America's best-selling novels of 1886. Yet, by the turn of the 20th century, the term Little Lord Fauntleroy denoted a so-called sissy boy. For example, we might only associate Little Lord Fauntleroy with the popular velvet suit with lace collars, sashes, and silk stockings that comprised Cedric's Van Dyke revival costume. And there you can see the influence of the book on children's fashions, particularly boys' fashions. Attributes of so-called sissy boys included timidity and a dependence on their mothers, and this derogatory label stemmed from a growing concern about effeminacy in boys. As a result, Professor Julia Grant observes that by the turn of the 20th century, Little Lord Fauntleroy had fallen into disrepute, and the bad boy of the Victorian storybook was resurrected as a regular or real boy. The real boy was not bad so much as mischievous and boisterous. Thomas Bailey Aldrich's memoir, The Story of a Bad Boy, helped to normalize this type of behavior. Little Lord Fauntleroy thus represented a transition in the conversation surrounding childhood and gender. Frances Hodgson Burnett created Cedric as a noble figure in his character and actions. Cedric embodies her definition of manliness. In some ways, the author's life reflects that of her character. Burnett was born in England, but became an American citizen. Similarly, Cedric is raised by an American mother, but discovers his British heritage through his paternal aristocratic grandfather. Burnett's concept of masculinity was influenced by British culture, whereas the American understanding of manliness centers on machismo. Cedric is a Victorian hybrid who is innately virtuous, but also uses his position to foster positive change. We'll jump back to the photo of the boys in their velvet suits. Again, these photographs indicate the commercialization of Little Lord Fauntleroy may have touched the Stuart family as well. This is another photo of Jimmy. He's a little bit older in this photograph, but you can see elements of the Little Lord Fauntleroy suit. He may not be wearing velvet, but he has the floppy bow tie, the riding crop, and it just looks like a little gentleman. So again, kind of some of that influence filtering down even into the Midwest. Jimmy, again, who was Minnie's nephew and the youngest child and only son of William K. Stewart, lost his mother at the age of 3. Mary Mariner Stewart died of tuberculosis in 1886 at the age of 36. Nevertheless, the presence of Jimmy's older sisters, his aunts, and his grandmother meant that he likely did not want for feminine influence. In fact, Little Lord Fauntleroy was a gift to Jimmy from his Aunt Ada, Mariner, who was Mary Mariner's younger sister. Jimmy seems to have embodied the image of the Victorian hybrid child as well. He was an intelligent boy by all accounts. He possessed a cheerful disposition, and yet he was also said to have been athletic. It would be easy to picture him with a book in his leisure time, and yet also taking time to go swimming, ride his bicycle, and exude that kind of rough and tumble image of an American boy. Scholar Patricia Crane notes that this romantic image we have of a child sitting with a book is a relatively modern one. By giving the younger generation books of their own and encouraging them to read, the Stewart family was ahead of its time. That's all for this episode of Front Porch Friday. If you'd like to learn more about children's literature, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, please check out these sources. And then if you are interested in finding more photos of the Stewart family, please search our digital archives and look for more content on Capopedia. Right? See you next time.